Towles. Peas, please. Peter had a pecker. Hey friends, welcome to Words, where we talk about the stories that define us and why they work so well. Now this week I want to delve a bit deeper into the work of an author I spoke about a few episodes ago when I went through my book stack. His name is Amor Towles. He's an American author, and his first work came out I think in about 2010, 2011, and it was Rules of Civility. And this has quickly become a modern classic because of its representation of such an iconic era, the 20s in America, New York City. It looks at Greenwich Village, Upper East Side, also goes into the countryside and Upper New York State. And so much was going on in the world in terms of the jazz revolution and the cultural revolution and feminism and all that kind of stuff was on the rise. And so it was kind of a really exciting time. Lots of Charlestons, lots of martinis, lots of fringe, dresses, short haircuts. It was all happening. And Amor Towles really tapped into that culture in Rules of Civility and brought to life some fantastic characters in the lead protagonist, Katie Content, her friend, and of course the fascinating male romantic interest, Tinker Gray. And what we see here is the rise and fall of different social classes in the 20s as represented in the relationship of Katie Content and Tinker Gray. And it's not just about the light and fluffy aspects of the 20s, it also does look into the way people used each other to social climb or for social escapism and things like that. And it does look at the toll it takes on lives and also families and generations, everything that was happening in that era. It's not too long, but it does challenge you with some interesting concepts of truth and of what is right, morality, what is right and wrong. In my book stack conversation, I spoke a bit about his second novel, which is A Gentleman in Moscow. It's going to be adapted into a series starring Kenneth Branagh, and that's going to be a lot of fun. It's very different in setting. It's quite different in tone. It's different in terms of the protagonist and perspective, but it is very similar in the style and in the type of narrative that is told. And it's also about this idea of social class, of rising and falling, fortunes and wealth and identity and prospects and what is happening socially and culturally in the moment of the book. It's actually set in the Metropole Hotel in Moscow, Russia, and it follows the life of this aristocrat who is under house arrest in the Hotel Metropole, and he's there for 30 years. And so we actually follow a bunch of his relationships and intrigues and complications and stuff that happens. And just like Rules of Civility, it ends on a bit of a tense, a climactic moment. And that's one thing I will say about all of Amor Towles' novels. Things really do build towards a final climactic ending. So two really fascinating books, one set in the 20s, one starting in the 20s and finishing in the 50s. And there are interesting parallels that happen between these two novels. Number 3 is The Lincoln Highway, and this was published not last year but the year before. And this was the third novel to come out in 10 years. Again, it's kind of a little bit longer, and it is firmly embedded in the 50s of America. And he uses context and location to build plot, to build character, to build narrative. Now, again, like the other two novels, there are parallels that come across them, and there is a similarity in terms of the narrative arc and where we're heading. But they are all very different in tone, and in perspective, and specifically in voice. And Rules of Civility is from the voice of Katie Content, who is a young woman, free, single, in 20s Greenwich Village, and about how she kind of negotiates the social world of Tinker Gray. A Gentleman in Moscow is this aristocratic older male voice, and he ages as the story goes along. So quite a different voice. The Lincoln Highway is set in the voice of a young man, 18-year-old Emmett Watson. And so again, we have this quite different sense of perspective, quite different voice, quite different character. And the first thing I want to talk about with regard to Amor Towles and why his books work so well is his use of setting, how thoroughly it is embedded in the time period and the era in which it is set. So in The Lincoln Highway, we are firmly embedded in 1950s Midwest America, and from there we actually take a journey across the continent of America America. And this was very much something that was taking the imagination of Americans in the 1950s, because the idea of the road trip had just kind of become this accessible thing, with highways being accessible, with cars being accessible. The 50s was a period of booming economics, and we have a lot of middle class families on the rise that are able to buy a lot more commodities, a lot more modern conveniences. So we've got the microwave, the TV. And one thing that definitely was on the rise in the 50s was the family car. And we suddenly have the highways of America opening up. There's this sense of opening up after the World Wars. And so we have this development of highway culture and people setting off in pursuit of their own destiny and their own ideas and for a bit of escapism on the roads. This novel is very much in that particular cultural moment and that particular landscape. And Amor Towles depicts that so thoroughly through a bit of an impressionist use of setting and time and place, and the way he describes what the characters see and what they feel about it. And landscape is very much an essential part. I'm actually going to put this down, otherwise I'm just going to be waving it in your face. Boop, 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 boop. The other thing that I really love, and you might kind of pick it up, it's definitely part of the marketing of the book, it's the cover. It's a powder blue 1948 Studebaker Land Cruiser. And so this car becomes very essential into the whole plot. Again, very much a 1950s cultural moment signifier, but also essential to the type of narrative that's going to unfold. The second thing I want to talk about is this idea of the quest. But what we have here specifically is a couple of boys setting out on this quest to find their mother. It's very clearly brought into the story at the start by Amor Towles' use of intertextuality. He brings this idea of other texts to bear on this novel in a way that informs us in terms of what these characters are doing, what their actions mean, who they might be identifying as. One of the central ideas of the quest archetype comes back to the hero's journey, as made popular by Joseph Campbell. And it's this idea that a hero sets off from his hometown, goes through a series of trials with some allies, goes into a foreign place, and then returns with something that will save his people or save himself, and returns a transformed person. Is very much a part of the construct of this novel. And he very clearly hints at that at the very start by including these different narratives into the story. Now, we have a couple of archetypes as well that play into the idea of the hero's journey. The hero is a mentor and a few friends and allies that help him along the way. Then there's, of course, villain characters. If you take it further in terms of the idea of these Greek myths, which is what quest hero journey is drawing on, it's the idea of the philoi, or the friendly bystanders that jump in and help as well. At the start is 18-year-old Emmett Watson, who is very much the hero character. Now, interestingly, his brother Billy, who was almost 10 years younger than him, ends up being kind of the mentor character, because he sort of is a little bit of a savant. We're not really sure, or he might be a little bit on the spectrum. It's kind of never really explained, but his fixation on certain objects and ideas certainly lends itself towards this idea of a bit of a really unique mind. And Billy is so important because he really informs on so much of what happens in the novel from a perspective of this idea of adventure and creativity, but also speaking very clearly to the emotional needs and the emotional desires of different people. Much more intuitive, he's much more interested in people and in broadening horizons and in ideas, whereas Emmett, his brother, is kind of very logical and very right and wrong orientated, and we kind of find out why as the story goes along. Emmett has actually been away at a juvenile detention facility, and the story begins as he's being driven home across these beautiful prairies, the idea of Midwest America. So Emmett is coming home to his brother. His father has died, his mother is long gone, and we have this idea of a character who is older than his years, and he's coming home and he's the sole carer of his brother. And so we've got this hero character in Emmett, we've got this younger brother, and we've got a car that Emmett saved up for and bought with his own money. As they go to set off on this adventure based on Billy's idea, is go and find their mother, because he believes that she's in San Francisco. What they discover, however, is that there are two of the inmates who were with Emmett in the detention facility have stowed away in the back of the warden's car. And so suddenly we have the Loki character in Duchess, and another kind of very interesting ally/companion in Wooly, the foil to Duchess's villainous kind of behaviour, and he's a bit more fascinated by beauty, and he gets kind of carried away with things, and he's kind of on a different tangent, and he creates this beautiful foil to the character of Duchess, who is very fast talking and very sarcastic. And in these two characters, they're kind of the winds that blow Emmett off course, but they're not necessarily stark villains. Now, Duchess kind of plays the villain character, but even towards the very end of the novel, we're left wondering, is he a true villain, or is he just a product of his upbringing and responding to his own circumstances and trying to make his own way? Tragic character who ended up just responding to the kind of difficult situations that he'd been given and ended up causing quite a bit of harm. And we've got Iago, who was very consciously, deliberately a villain from the outset. So we've got these two tragic characters with very different motivations. Amor Towles forces us to consider what kind of villain character is Duchess. Is he a straight villain, or is he a tragic kind of unfortunate villain who's just responding to his own survival and his own reaction to life? So we've got these very four clear archetypical characters. Now they set off on this road trip journey, but very quickly it is subverted. The car gets stolen, so they have to go in a different direction to New York City in order to get this car back. They end up traveling by train, by foot. And so what we have is this idea of the subverted road narrative, which starts off in one direction but ends up going in the other direction. And it's not until the end of the novel actually that the boys kind of get what they need to be able to set off onto their journey. And so what happens along the way is they meet a character called Ulysses, and this is significant because back to the idea of intertextuality is we have Billy with his big book that he carries around, Professor Abacus Abernathy's Compendium of Heroes, Adventurers and Other Intrepid Travellers. So I had to read that to get that right. So this compendium, an A to Z of all these guys throughout mythology and history who have changed the world in different ways. And Billy kind of constantly refers to this in terms of like, what should we do now? And that lends this very much this inventive, adventurous idea to the whole journey of the boys. And in particular, what is referenced is the Odyssey and the adventure of Ulysses and Odysseus. Amor Towles specifically brings this in a character called Ulysses, who drops into the narrative literally through a hole in a train car and kind of saves a moment of tension. It becomes really important to the boy's journey, and he helps them along the way. Later on, we actually meet Abacus Abernathy as a character. He comes into the book, and so we've got this kind of like author informing on the characters, informing on an author of a book they're reading, starting to get this bit of a meta thread happening through the book as well. And what we find at the very end, as the boys overcome challenge after challenge after challenge, and certain of them do definitely reference these ideas from Ulysses, the sirens and Calypso, paralleled in different experiences that the boys have in New York City. And finally, they reach their destination, their subverted destination, and get what they want, but it's through very, very conflicted moral means. And this is a really interesting thing about all of Amor Towles' novels, is that we have this question of morality. And at the end, we're kind of left wondering, with this character, Emmett, who has very, very carefully tried to follow right and wrong. He's kind of brought to this point where there is no real right path. And so he chooses the fate and the well-being of his people over anything else. And this is very much harking back to the idea of the Ulysses quest, and Ulysses himself being a man of trouble and toil, making these complex, conflicted moral decisions about his sailors and about what happens along the journey in order to get home and save his wife and his son and his home, Ithaca. And so it's very interesting the way Amor Towles has brought this complexity into bear on the novel. Why does Amor Towles work so well? His use of setting, his use of these ideas of intertextuality and quest and archetypes, but then his subversion of those traditional models to surprise us, to add layers and complexity to characters and to drive our interest and to drive meaning, and also shocking moral decisions that the characters have to make both along the way and at the climax. And what you find with Amor Towles is that nothing is wasted. Everything that the characters go through builds up to informing on the decisions that they make in the final pages of the novel. A really particular way of writing that is actually just incredibly clever, so rewarding for a reader, and so much artistry for an author. Amor Towles is really one of those novelists that bridges the gap between, I suppose, genre writing and literature. He writes really complex, really beautiful, really nuanced stuff. but it's stories that grab us and grip us and entertain. And to me, those are the most effective types of stories. That is what works so well about Amor Towles' novels. So I recommend Rules of Civility, A Gentleman in Moscow, and his final one, The Lincoln Highway. Thanks so much for joining us on this episode of Words. Please like, subscribe, and follow us on our socials. And please comment below if you have anything else to add about the work of Amor Towles or authors that straddle the genre literature barrier. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time from Words. My name's Elise James. Bye.